Okay, today, guys, we're going to be talking about the colonial empires and the American Revolution. This is a section that we've been working on for the last couple of days. So we're going to go right into it, and we're going to look at our learning objectives for this lesson. You want to jot these down real quick. Explain colonial empires of Latin America. Describe the formation of Great Britain and its vast empire. Describe the American Revolution and the events which occurred, and explain the birth of America and how Enlightenment principles were adopted in the creation of a new government. Again, if you need to pause the video and jot these down, feel free to do so, and I'll give you a second, and then we're going to move on. One of the things that you might want to do is do this warm-up activity. Go ahead and write these down and then answer them. What rights are guaranteed to all Americans by the Constitution? If you need to research it, research this, and go ahead and put your answers in. And then which of these rights do you consider to be the most important? And then tell me why. So put these at the beginning of your notes to add to that. So let's open up with an introduction to this lesson. The introduction is going to be this definition of colonialism. What was colonialism? Well, colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. So that is the definition for colonialism. And all the things that we're going to talk about in this lesson are going to be talking about these colonies that are going to be produced by these European countries and how these colonies are eventually going to break away. We can't start this lesson without talking about what was it like in the 16th century and to understand what was going on during that period. One of the main things that you really need to know is that there were a lot of European countries involved in the New World, mainly in the Americas. And a lot of these European countries had established colonies all over the world. And their main objective was to spread their culture into these countries and eventually maybe even their ethnicity into these countries. So this was how things were in the 16th century. And of course, when we're talking about the 16th century, we're talking about the 1500s, if you don't understand that whole policy there. So we're going to start with colonial empires in Latin America. And in the 16th century, Portugal is going to dominate most of Brazil, which you see here pictured on the map, which is in South America. At the same time, Spain is going to establish colonies all throughout Central, North, and South America. So Spain is going to dominate those areas along with Portugal. We know that Latin America is going to be made up of a multiracial society. We see a couple of different groups. The first being the mestizos, which are going to be a combination of European and Native Americans that had intermarried. And then we also are going to have another group called the mulattoes. Almost 8 million slaves were brought to Latin America during this period. And some of those slaves, again, would intermarry with the Europeans, and we would end up with the mulattoes. But for the most part, there were four groups. Those groups would have been the Europeans, the Africans, the Native Americans, the mestizos, and the mulattoes, which is actually five groups, but five groups that would be living in Latin America during this period. The Portuguese and the Spanish are both going to profit from their colonies in Latin America. They're going to end up realizing that there's an abundance of gold and silver, which was going to be their main source of wealth. So this is how they're going to get very rich during this period. But there are going to be other products there too that are going to be shipped to Europe, including sugar, tobacco, diamonds, and animal hides, which are all going to bring in money for those countries too. Latin American agriculture was dominated by large landowners, and Native Americans either worked on the estates of the large landowners or worked as poor farmers on marginal lands. This system of large landowners and dependent peasants has remained a lasting feature even today in Latin American society. So, again, some of the things that were going on in the 1500s, you still even have some of those things present in Latin America today. Spanish and Portuguese monarchs are going to try to oversee these empires, but the difficulties of communication and travel is going to make this pretty impossible for Spain and Portugal and some of the other European countries that were involved. But as a result, these colonial officials in Latin America are going to have a great deal of freedom in carrying out imperial policies. So they're going to allow them to have some freedom, especially with the people that they were going to put in charge. Um, Spanish and Portuguese rulers were determined to Christianize the native people to turn them into Christians. This policy is going to give the Catholic Church an important role in the Americas, because you're going to see a lot of Catholic missionaries that are going to come there to different parts of the Spanish Empire. To make their efforts easier, these missionaries are going to bring Native Americans together into villages or missions, which there were missions all over the U.S. as well, where the native people could be converted, taught trade, and encouraged to grow crops. These missions are going to make it possible for the missionaries to control the lives of the Native Americans. So they, were sort of trying to assimilate these people to bring them into the culture, and hopefully they wouldn't revolt or try to fight back. The Catholic Church is also going to build cathedrals, hospitals, orphanages, and schools in these colonies. So the Catholic Church is playing a major role in Latin America. The Catholic Church also allowed women who did not wish to marry to enter into convents and become nuns. So like you have a monastery for monks, you have convents for nuns. Many of these nuns are going to work outside their convents by running schools and hospitals. So, again, the Catholic Church is going to play a major role in Latin America. So, your first question for this section is going to be, what role did the Catholic Church play in Latin America? And we just talked about what some of those roles were just a few minutes ago. Let's move on to Britain and British North America. We're going to talk about how Britain gets formed. Britain, or the United Kingdom, came into existence in the year 1707 when the governments of England and Scotland were united. So you definitely want to know that. The term British came to refer to both the English and the Scots. In the 18th century, Britain, the monarch, and the parliament all shared power. So in the 18th century, you got a sharing of power, with parliament gradually gaining more power. By 1714, a new dynasty, the Hanoverians, was established when the last Stuart ruler, Queen Anne, died without an heir. The crown was offered to her nearest relatives, Protestant rulers of the German state of Hanover. Were going to be the rulers that were going to take over, and this is where we're going to get King George. But we're going to get King George I and King George II in Britain during that period. The British system was very well established and allowed their chief ministers to handle Parliament, and we just talked about how they shared power. One of the most well known of these chief ministers is going to be a guy named William Pitt the Elder, who Pittsburgh is named for in Pennsylvania. But he became the head of cabinet in 1757, and he's going to expand the British Empire by acquiring Canada and India during the 7 Years' War. You see there's a picture of William Pitt on this slide. The British colonies in North America were thickly populated, mainly along the East Coast. They had more than 1 million people living in the English colonies, or the 13 colonies, by 1750. The colonies were supposedly run by the British Board of Trade, the Royal Council, and the Parliament. But the colonies also had legislatures. These legislatures were set up locally, and they tended to act independently from the British government. Merchants in many of these cities did not want the British government to run their affairs. So Britain is sort of leaving the colonies alone. This is called a policy known as salutary neglect. and they're going to leave them alone and sort of let them run themselves until the 7 Years' War. After the 7 Years' War, Britain's going to accumulate a huge debt that's going to have to be repaid, and the way they're going to try to repay it is through the colonies. So, why did the British heads of cabinet become more powerful in the 18th century? And that's the next question for this lesson, for this section. Let's move on to the American Revolution. The British wanted to collect revenue from their colonies to pay for the 7 Years' War, which we talked about in the last lesson. The 7 Years' War, of course, was the French and Indian War in North America. So they're going to try to tax the colonists. One of the first taxes that they're going to impose is going to be something known as the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is where Parliament imposed this act on the colonies, which required that printed materials would carry a stamp showing that a tax has been paid to Britain. This is going to outrage the colonists because naturally everybody, buys newspapers and all these different things, and the colonists are not going to want to pay it. Eventually, Britain realizes that they're having an issue with this, and they're going to repeal it because of the colonists' opposition. But the seed is already planted for revolution because of the Stamp Act. Now, the American Revolution is going to begin with a couple of different things. The opposition, of course, to the Stamp Act in 1766, when it was repealed, is going to be one thing that's going to lead to the American Revolution. So the colonies are going to organize what they call the First Continental Congress, and this is going to meet in Philadelphia in 1774. The main thing they wanted to do was to mainly talk about their differences with Britain. But shortly after the First Continental Congress meets, fighting is going to erupt between the colonists and the British Army in April of 1775 at a place called Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. This would be the first battle of the American Revolution. Shortly after that, the Second Continental Congress is going to meet, and they are going to agree to form a Continental Army. And that Continental Army would be led by none other than George Washington. George Washington would be chosen as the commander-in-chief. On July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress is going to approve a Declaration of Independence, which is a breakup letter to Great Britain saying, hey, we're not going to put up with you anymore. The Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson, which you see pictured here. And the American Revolution is going to continue on from 1775 to 1781. Now, the colonies are eventually going to get support from other foreign countries who were looking at ways to get back at Great Britain for the wars that they had fought before. So they were looking for revenge against the British. The French are going to supply the colonies with arms and money to the rebels. French officers and soldiers are also going to come into Washington's army, one of them being Lafayette, which he actually came to Georgetown, if you didn't know that. But Lafayette would arrive and help fight against the British from France. Spain and the Dutch Republic also entered the war against Great Britain, mainly fighting in Europe. And eventually, the British are going to be defeated. The leader, or the British general that surrenders to George Washington, is a guy named Lord Cornwallis, or General Cornwallis. He's going to surrender at a place called Yorktown. Yorktown is in Virginia. He's going to be surrounded by the French Navy and the army of George Washington, and he can't escape because the French Navy is fighting off the British Navy off the coast of Virginia, and George Washington and his army on the land are going to be able to surround and force Cornwallis to surrender. The treaty that ends the American Revolution was the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And in that treaty, it's going to give the Americans control of the Western Territory from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, along with the original 13 colonies. The American Revolution is going to be viewed as the embodiment of the Enlightenment's political dream. So, all those ideas that we've already discussed are going to take place in the American Revolution. One country that's really going to take notice of the American Revolution is going to be France. So, our question for this section is, what country supported the American colonies in their war against the British? Take a minute, pause it, jot that question down, and then answer it. Our final section is going to be the birth of a nation. Uh, the 13 colonies are now free from Great Britain, and a constitution is going to be written, but this early constitution is going to be called the Articles of Confederation. So when you see that AOC, an acronym, that stands for Articles of Confederation. This new constitution is going to create a weak central government. And that means that the federal government's not going to have a lot of power, and it's mainly going to put most of the power within the hands of the states. But the Articles of Confederation were very, very weak. They didn't let Congress have the power to tax. It didn't allow the federal government to raise an army. The executive branch would have no power. So it was considered a very weak document. And because of its weakness, the Congress is going to decide that they need to come up with a new constitution, a new social contract. And we've talked about what the social contract was. But in 1788, they decide that they need something else. So they're going to create a new document, which is going to be our Constitution, which is still around today. The creation of this Constitution is going to make up all of those Enlightenment concepts of liberty and representative government a reality for the very first time. One of the things that the Constitution is going to do is it's going to create a federal system. This federal system is when you have power shared between the national and the state government. So you don't have just one part having more power than the other. We're also going to create a concept of separation of powers, and we're going to create three branches of government: an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, all from the ideas of Montesquieu. Each branch would have the power to check the other branches if necessary. The legislative branch would consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives, which is our Congress today. And the third branch, which was the judicial branch, would consist of the Supreme Court and all of the other federal courts. And the executive branch will consist of the presidency. So those are our three branches, and this is all going to be created by the U.S. Constitution with separation of powers between the three branches. Now, the Constitution at first is not going to be well received, and the reason why was going to be because some people thought that the federal government had too much power, and they thought that the federal government would use that power to trample on the rights of citizens. And so, in order to appease everybody and to make everyone happy, a Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. And in this Bill of Rights, 10 amendments were put in that guaranteed natural rights to all Americans. And of course, they're getting this idea from John Locke. Remember the idea of natural rights. But in 1789, the new Congress is going to propose 12 amendments, and 10 of these were approved by states, which became known as the Bill of Rights. These amendments guaranteed freedom of religion, freedom of speech, press, petition, and assembly. They're going to give Americans the right to bear arms and to be protected against unreasonable searches and seizures. They guarantee trial by jury, due process of the law, and the protection of property rights for all Americans. Many of these rights were derived from the natural rights proposed by the 18th century philosophies like John Locke. So that's where they're going to get these ideas from. So, our final question for this section: how did the Articles of Confederation differ from the Constitution? Pause the video, write that down, jot down your answer, and then move on. One last thing that I would love for you guys to do is to make sure that you list all the vocabulary words. Here they all are, and then I want you to define these words based on what you've written down out of your notes and how they apply to this section. Don't just look them up on Google. Go back and see if you've written these down and then determine a definition that would match up for each one of these words. And that will help you as far as your review is going to go for your notes. Don't forget to answer your learning objective questions, and that's going to do it for this lesson. Again, if you've got any questions, feel free to jot those down on your notes when you're finished, and I'll be glad to answer them in class. And I will catch you guys on the next one.